So today is our third Sunday in a series that we've been doing on Acts. We're studying about how the early church was born and how this love and awareness of Christ began to bubble over out of Jerusalem into Judea and Samaria and beyond. We're looking at what that was like for the early Christians and the early church, and trying to discern what that might be like for us if God continues to bubble over in our community and out of our lives. What might that look like? Last week we talked about what we call evangelism. Kind of the covenant community way. We talked a little bit about that. That's kind of a tricky word for us. But if you look at the story of Acts, there is this evangelism, this going out and sharing about this Christ, this sharing about the experience of new life and renewal that was happening. And so we talked a little bit about three ways in which we bubble over with our own gospel lives, with this awareness and love. We talked that one of the ways that we have to share that is through invitation into a way of life. That covenant community is committed to a way of life, and we have that to go out into the world with. That's one of the ways the gospel bubbles over, is an invitation to all people to come and participate in this way of life. The second thing we talked about is that we are all called to articulate our faith, and the struggle with doing that in the world we live in. And even if that articulation comes in the form of questions, that our gospel, the good news that we often proclaim, is an openness to question. And it comes in our own stories of how God is bubbling over in our lives. The third thing we talked about was that God bubbles over through an open heart. We read about Rumi and inviting us to close our words, to open our heart, and let the Spirit speak. So that's where we are, a sense that God is bubbled over in Acts, this fountain of life and renewal and restoration, and how that begins to bubble over. The scripture passage for today is a little bit later in Acts. And what we begin seeing is what roads that this love begins to take. The roads that it begins to travel on. And so I want to read it again. We've already heard it. But want to read it and invite you to listen to how this gospel, where and how it rolls out. Then an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Get up and go to the south, to the road that goes to Jerusalem." So he got up and he went. Now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home, seated in his chariot. And he was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, "Go over to this chariot and join it." So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" The Ethiopian replied, "How can I, unless someone guides me?" And he invited Philip to get in beside him. Now the passage of Scripture that he was reading was this: "Like a sheep he was led to slaughter, and like a lamb silent before his shearer, he does not even open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth." And the eunuch asked Philip, About whom does the prophet speak? About himself or someone else?" And then Philip began to speak. And starting with the Scriptures, he proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. As they were going along the road, they came to some water. When they came to it, the Ethiopian eunuch said, "Look, here is water. Is there anything that is keeping me from being baptized?" And so the Spirit came upon Philip, and he baptized the Ethiopian. And when he had done this, the Spirit snatched Philip away. But Philip found himself at Assos, and there he was passing through the region, and he proclaimed the gospel to all of the towns in which he came. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So here we have this wonderful story of how the gospel, how this good news, how this love, this awareness, this restoration begins to bubble over. One of the things that we need to know about the context of this story is before the early church was created, this whole area, which is often called the Mediterranean area, was conquered by Alexander the Great, who came from Rome. And as he conquered, he came through all of this region, and when he conquered it, he created these roads, literal roads, that began to unite this whole area. They were united by these travel roads. And so often people from Africa and Egypt would travel along, and here is Jerusalem. They would travel along and come up, and this became a literal freeway of trade and cultural exchange. And so the early church found in Jerusalem automatically had all of these connections, all of these literal roads to this whole area. And that is one of the reasons why they say Christianity was able to grow so quickly, is that the structure of the region had already been created. The roads among which and along which this good news of another way of life had already been created, and that the early church just traveled. The early church just went out onto the road, wherever those roads went, and where they encountered people, and where they encountered God along the way, the gospel broke out. Love and reconciliation happened. And so that's the context for the Acts stories. These roads around which they begin to travel. So I'm wondering, what are these roads for us? What are these pathways along which we get to be present in the world with a gospel of radical love and acceptance and inclusion? Where we get to be present where there is water that heals and restores. What are those roads? There's a lot of talk going on about globalization. Some of you may have read some of the books. There's a book that came out a couple of years ago called The World is Flat. And in this book, the author describes 4 roads of globalization. 4 main places where there is movement going on all over the world. Where there are boundaries being crossed. Where we are becoming one people. And there are 4 main roads that's happening on. He said that those roads are currency, culture, technology, and immigration.